When Victoria Harrison screamed, "My granddaughter will inherit everything, and you will get nothing," in Mr. Pierce's office, Grace didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the sealed envelope lying on the mahogany desk. An envelope with a golden crest that held Edward's last words. $50 million. The townhouse. The company. Sophie's entire life depended on that piece of paper, and everyone expected Grace to beg. The wall clock read 3:47 in the afternoon. The scent of old leather from the law books mingled with Victoria's oppressive designer perfume. Grace clutched the strap of her worn handbag, her hands trembling imperceptibly. Her simple black dress was a stark contrast to the diamonds on her mother-in-law's neck. Mr. Pierce was sweating. His fingers hesitated over the red wax seal. In the chair beside her, Sophie was drawing colorful hearts on a piece of paper, oblivious to the silent storm that was about to shatter her childhood. But Grace wasn't there for the inheritance. She was there because she had promised Edward 3 weeks earlier, as he held her hand in the hospital and whispered with his last breath, "Protect Sophie from the truth about my mother, no matter what it costs." The sealed envelope held more than a will. It held the reason Edward died on that highway. And Victoria had no idea what was about to be revealed. In the corner, Olivia twisted her hands nervously, because she knew what was in that envelope and was terrified of losing her mother forever. Mr. Pierce avoided Victoria's gaze, because Edward had told him a secret that would destroy the Harrison family's reputation in a matter of minutes. Leaning against the wall, Richard Vance watched in absolute silence, because if Grace lost everything, he would buy the company for half its price and make millions from their ruin. But this story didn't begin there. It began 12 years ago when Grace saved a man's life on a rainy night and made an enemy who would never forgive her. It continued 8 years later, when a DNA test was demanded and a terrible accusation nearly destroyed a marriage. And it culminated 3 weeks before, when the brakes on a car failed, and Edward whispered words that only Grace heard. The truth always had multiple faces. This one had 3, and none of them were what they seemed. To understand how Grace ended up in that office, you need to know 3 stories that intertwine like the threads of a deadly web. The story from 12 years ago when she saved a life and sealed her fate. The story from 8 years ago when blood was tested and lies were planted. And the story from 3 weeks ago when death arrived disguised as an accident. It all began on an October night in the emergency room of Mount Sinai Hospital. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you don't miss a single story. Over 500,000 women are already part of this community. Be the next one. 12 years earlier. Grace Taylor woke up at 2 in the afternoon every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Night shift at Mount Sinai, a 400-square-foot apartment in Queens, 2 months behind on rent. 31 years old, brown hair always pulled back in a tight bun. Green eyes that carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen too many people die. Skillful hands calloused from holding syringes and hopes. She saved every penny. Instant noodles for breakfast. A crowded subway to the hospital. Simple, controlled, predictable life. Exactly the way she needed it to be. At the hospital, the nurses called her Grace Under Fire, because she saved lives even when protocols said to wait. A rigid code of ethics. She refused bribes from wealthy patients who wanted to cut in line. Her main quality, unshakable courage in an emergency. Her flaw, a stubbornness that put her at odds with her bosses. A chronic inability to trust authority. She always questioned orders when she thought they were wrong. That's why she had 3 warnings in 2 years. But not a single patient lost to negligence. That counted for more than paperwork. At 15, Grace lost her mother. Breast cancer. The public health system had failed her. A late diagnosis, inadequate treatment, 6 months of agony. Her father disappeared when she was 8. Just walked out to buy cigarettes and never came back. She was in the foster care system from 9 to 18. She paid her way through nursing school by washing dishes in a diner. Her emotional walls were as high as skyscrapers. She didn't let herself dream of a family. Love was a dangerous luxury. The trauma of abandonment had taught her people always leave, so it was better not to get attached. Better to keep a safe distance from any deep feelings. But she kept old magazines under her bed. Houses with gardens, children running on green lawns, families smiling on wooden porches. A secret dream she was ashamed of. She wanted to belong to something bigger than herself. To have children. To wake up with someone beside her. The physical symbol of this impossible desire was a small music box from her mother. Her only inheritance. The wood was worn, the broken ballerina still spun crookedly. It played somewhere over the rainbow. Grace would open the box during sleepless nights and cry, because that song represented the home she never had, and probably never would. October. Heavy rain, 3:20 in the morning. An ambulance arrived with an unconscious man. An accident on the FDR drive, a rolled-over car, severe internal bleeding. Grace saw the monitor. His pressure was dropping fast. The surgeon on call was in another emergency. Medical protocol. Wait. Stabilize and wait. But she knew that look. The man would be dead in 10 minutes. Grace made a decision in 3 seconds. She grabbed a scalpel. Prep the OR. I'm opening him up now. A nurse hesitated. You're not a surgeon. Grace was already scrubbing in. He doesn't have 10 minutes. She made the incision. Steady hands. She located the bleeding, precise sutures. 22 minutes later, the man's breathing was stable. She had saved Edward Harrison's life, and she didn't know she had just changed her own forever. Edward woke up 3 days later. His brown eyes were confused, trying to understand where he was. Grace was checking his phone when he spoke. It was you. His voice was hoarse. The nurse said you operated on me. She didn't look at him. I did my job. He tried to sit up. You saved my life. Grace adjusted his pillow. Anyone would have done the same. A lie. They both knew it. Edward smiled. It was tired, but genuine. Thank you. Grace left the room before he could see the blush on her cheeks. A week later, Edward returned to the hospital. Not as a patient. He was carrying white roses. He looked for Grace in the emergency room. She was just finishing her shift, exhausted. He appeared in front of her. We need to talk. Grace sighed. You don't have to thank me again. Edward held out the flowers. I didn't come to thank you. I came to ask you to dinner. She looked at the roses as if they were a trap. I can't accept these. He didn't move. Why not? Grace looked away. Because you're a patient. Edward smiled. I was discharged 3 days ago. So technically I'm not. She tried to walk past him. He gently blocked her way. One dinner. That's all. You saved my life. At least let me buy you a decent meal. Grace hesitated. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to refuse. But there was something in his eyes, a sincerity she rarely saw. All right, one dinner. The dinner was at a simple restaurant. Edward insisted that she choose the place. Grace took him to a cheap Italian diner near the hospital. He didn't complain. He ate his pasta as if it were the best meal of his life. They talked for 3 hours. He told her about his work. The family business, real estate, the constant pressure to marry well. She told him about foster care, late-night college classes, a fatigue that had become routine. He looked at her as if every word she said was important. You're a hero, Grace, she laughed. I'm a tired nurse who's behind on her rent. Edward got serious. I'm going to give you the family you've always deserved. Grace stopped laughing. She looked into his eyes, searching for a joke. She didn't find one. He was being sincere. He took her hand across the table. It was the first time in 12 years that Grace allowed hope to walk through the door she had kept locked. The Harrison family was an empire built over 3 generations. A real estate development firm with shopping malls and commercial high-rises all over New York City. 50 million in declared assets. Probably double that undeclared. The mansion was an Upper East Side townhouse. 8,000 square feet of history and power. Classic revival architecture, marble floors, gardens that required 3 full-time gardeners. Period furniture, famous paintings on the walls, a crystal chandelier in the dining room that cost more than Grace's entire apartment. Victoria Harrison had been in charge for 23 years, ever since her husband died of a heart attack. She was 45 when she was widowed. She took over the company in a world dominated by men. She fought. She threatened. She won. She turned 5 million into 50. She controlled every decision in the company, every move her children made, every dollar that came in or went out. Her social reputation was impeccable. She was at every high society event. Olivia, her daughter, had married a lawyer from a traditional family, chosen by Victoria. Edward, her son, was under constant pressure to find a suitable wife. An unwritten but absolute rule. Harrisons marry Harrisons, same social class, same educational background, same political connections. Grace was everything Victoria despised. Humble origins, foster care, a blue-collar profession. No family, no name, no money. She represented a threat to the established order. Edward took her to dinner at the townhouse 6 months after their first date. Grace wore a dress borrowed from a coworker because she had nothing appropriate. Victoria greeted her at the door. A look that sized you up in 2 seconds and condemned you in 3. Welcome. A voice as cold as marble. The dinner was a silent torture. Too many forks, glasses for different wines, conversations about people Grace had never heard of. Victoria made subtle comments. It must be so difficult working at night, so dangerous in that part of the city. Grace swallowed the humiliation, smiled politely. Edward didn't notice the tension, or pretended not to. After dinner, Victoria asked to speak with Grace privately. In the library, the walls were lined with books that no one read. Victoria closed the door. "I'll be direct. How much do you want?" Grace blinked. "Excuse me?" Victoria opened her purse. "A checkbook. To end things with my son. Write any number." Grace felt her blood boil. "I'm not with Edward for his money." Victoria smiled. It was humorless. They all say that. "How much?" Grace stood up. "Nothing. Because I'm not what you think I am." Victoria blocked the door. "You are not worthy of him. You never will be. I am capable of destroying you. Do you understand?" Grace looked her in the eyes. "I understand that you're afraid of losing control, but Edward is a grown man, and he chose me." She walked out of the library, shaking with rage. 4 months later, Edward proposed. On a beach in the Hamptons at sunset. A simple ring, silver with a small diamond. Nothing ostentatious. Grace cried. For the first time in years, they were tears of happiness. Yes, he kissed her. The waves crashed on the shore. Seagulls flew overhead. A perfect moment she had never imagined she would live. They planned their future sitting on the sand. 2 children. A house smaller than the mansion but comfortable. Edward would work at the company. Grace would continue nursing. A normal life despite the money. He held her face in his hands. "My mother will come around. She just needs time." Grace wanted to believe him. But doubt was already planting roots in the back of her mind. Victoria wasn't a woman who accepted defeat. She was a woman who waited, plotted, and attacked when you least expected it. Grace hugged Edward tighter, as if a hug could protect their future. But she already knew. The storm was just beginning. And when it came, it would be devastating. 4 years after the wedding, Grace was holding the ultrasound scan in her hand when Victoria walked into the room without knocking. 12 weeks pregnant. The paper trembled between her fingers. Victoria snatched the scan from her hand. Her eyes scanned every line. A heavy silence. Then, her voice. "You planned this." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Grace took a deep breath. "Planned it? I've been married for 4 years. Victoria threw the paper on the table. "You planned it to trap my son. To secure the inheritance." Grace felt the floor drop out from under her. "How can you say that?" Victoria stepped closer. "I know your type. I always have. Family dinner that night. A long mahogany table, 12 place settings, food served on silver platters. Edward at the head of the table, Grace to his right, Victoria to his left, Olivia and her husband Bradley in the middle. An awkward silence as they ate. Edward noticed. Did something happen? Victoria dabbed her mouth with her linen napkin. "Grace is pregnant." Edward dropped his fork. A huge smile spread across his face. "Really? Honey, is it true?" Grace nodded. He stood up, hugged her. "This is wonderful," Victoria continued, cutting her steak. "Wonderful or convenient?" Edward let go of Grace. "Mom, what did you just say?" Victoria looked at him. "I said it's convenient. 4 years of marriage. And now, of all times, she gets pregnant." Grace felt her blood boil. Her hands clenched into fists under the table. Her nails dug into her palms. "What exactly are you implying?" Victoria didn't look away. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. This pregnancy is strategic." Edward slammed his hand on the table. "That's enough." "Mom, this is absurd." Victoria stood up. "What's absurd is that you can't see it. This child isn't a real Harrison. It's a tool." Grace stood up too, shaking. "Edward, let's go." He took her hand. "Mom, if you don't apologize right now, we are never coming back here." Victoria adjusted her pearl necklace. "You will regret this." Silence. Edward pulled Grace away. They left. Olivia watched everything quietly. Bradley went on eating as if nothing had happened. In the car, Grace cried. Not from sadness, from pure rage. Edward drove in silence, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "She apologize." "She will." Grace wiped her tears. "No, she won't. And you know it." He didn't answer, because she was right. Victoria Harrison never apologized. Not ever. Not to anyone. Grace looked out the window. The city lights blurred past. She thought about the child growing inside her, thought about how to protect this life from a grandmother who already rejected it before it was even born. She wondered if she had made the right choice in marrying Edward. She wondered for the first time if love was enough to fight so much poison. The answer terrified her, because it wasn't. Love is never enough when there's money and power on the other side of the table. She placed a hand on her stomach. She made a silent promise. "I will protect you, no matter what happens. I will protect you from that woman." 3 months later, Grace was trying to build bridges. She visited Victoria every Thursday afternoon. She brought flowers, asked about the company, listened to old family stories. She smiled when she was subtly insulted. She swallowed her pride like bitter medicine. Edward thought it was working, see? She's warming up to you. Grace didn't correct him, but she knew the truth. Victoria was documenting every mistake, every social blunder, every misplaced word. She was taking notes, saving them, building a silent dossier. Grace used the wrong fork at dinner? Noted. Grace didn't know the name of a famous artist? Noted. Grace said thank you instead of sending a handwritten note? Noted. Every failure was ammunition, and Victoria was a patient sniper. Sophie was born in March. A difficult birth. 23 hours of labor. Grace almost died from a hemorrhage. But when they placed the baby girl in her arms, nothing else mattered. Blue eyes like Edward's, dark hair like Grace's. Perfect, Edward cried. Grace did too. The moment should have been pure. But Victoria arrived at the hospital 2 hours later. She looked at the baby through the nursery window. She didn't smile. She turned to Edward. I need to speak with you, privately. Grace saw them from her room window. Edward and Victoria talking in the hallway. A heated discussion. Edward gesturing. Victoria calm, cold, relentless. 15 minutes later, Edward came back. He was pale. Grace took his hand. What is it? He didn't answer right away. He sat in the chair next to the bed. My mother wants a paternity test. Silence. Grace thought she had misheard. She wants what? Edward buried his face in his hands. A DNA test. To prove that I'm the father. Grace felt something inside her break. Something that could never be fixed. You're joking. He looked at her. His eyes were red. I told her she was crazy. I yelled at her. But she won't back down. Grace pulled her hand away. And do you believe her? Edward stood up quickly. Of course not. Grace, I know Sophie is my daughter. Grace sat up in bed, even with the pain. Then say no. Refuse. Edward hesitated. For 3 seconds. But it was 3 seconds too long. Grace saw the doubt. It was small, tiny, but it was there. She said that if I don't do the test, she'll disinherit me. She cut me out of the company. She'll make our lives impossible. Grace turned her face away. Then do the test, prove to your mother that she's wrong, and then never speak to me about it again. Olivia showed up in the room that night. Late, visiting hours were over, but she had bribed a security guard. She sat down next to Grace. I heard about the test. Grace didn't look at her. Apparently everyone heard. Olivia took a deep breath. My mother did the same thing to me, 12 years ago. Grace turned. What? Olivia had tears in her eyes. When I got pregnant, she demanded a DNA test. Said that Bradley couldn't be trusted, that I might have cheated. The stress was so much that I lost the baby. At 22 weeks, Grace took her hand. Olivia, I didn't know. Olivia wiped her tears. No one knows. My mother covered it up, said it was a natural miscarriage. But I know the truth. It was the test. It was the accusation. It was her. Grace was in the hospital for 3 days. Edward did the DNA test on the second day. Olivia took Sophie to get her sample collected. Grace refused to participate. The result came by email 2 days later. A 99.9% probability of paternity. Edward was the father. The scientific proof of something that should never have been questioned. Edward showed the result to Victoria. He expected an apology. He didn't get one. Good to know there's no doubt. That was it. No retraction. No apology to Grace. No acknowledgement of how absurd the accusation had been. Edward left his mother's office furious. For the first time in his life, he questioned who Victoria really was. Not the strong matriarch who built an empire, but the cruel woman capable of destroying her own family to maintain control. 3 years passed. Awkward, tense. Grace and Edward raised Sophie far from Victoria. They only visited on mandatory occasions. Christmas, Easter, birthdays. Edward worked at the company but kept an emotional distance from his mother. Olivia divorced Bradley. Victoria was furious but couldn't stop it. The cracks in the Harrison family were growing. And then Edward found the documents. It was a Friday night. Edward was reviewing old contracts in his home office, preparing a presentation for the board. He found an inconsistency. A $3 million payment to a vendor that didn't exist. He investigated. He discovered more. A bank account in a tax haven. Monthly transfers for 5 years. Money embezzled from their own company. And all the transactions were authorized by one person, Victoria. Edward called the accountant. He confirmed it. $3 million had vanished. Victoria had blamed the previous partner, a man who was fired and sued for embezzlement. An innocent man who lost his reputation, his career, his family, all based on Victoria's lie. Edward showed up at the townhouse unannounced, 11 o'clock at night. Victoria was still awake, reading in the library. He threw the documents on her desk. Explain this. Victoria looked at the papers, no surprise. No guilt. Where'd you get these? Edward slammed his hand on the desk. It doesn't matter. You embezzled $3 million. You destroyed an innocent man. Victoria calmly closed her book. I did what was necessary to protect this family. Edward laughed. It was a humorless laugh. Protect? You stole. You lied. You ruined a man's life. Victoria stood up. That man was weak. He didn't belong beside the Harrisons. I just sped up the inevitable. Edward looked at his mother as if he were seeing her for the first time. You've lied about everything. Always. Victoria adjusted her shawl. I built this family by myself. When your father died, no one gave us any credit. Literally, I had to make hard choices. Unpopular ones. But they were necessary. Edward picked up the documents. I'm going to expose this. I'm going to give the money back to Richard. I'm going to clear his name. Victoria took a step forward. Her voice was low. Dangerous. If you do that, you'll destroy our reputation. The company will fall. Everything I've built will be gone. Edward walked to the door. You should have thought of that before you started stealing. He left. Victoria was left alone in the library. For the first time in 20 years, she felt the fear of losing control. Olivia called Grace the next morning. Edward told me. About the embezzlement. About Richard. Grace was making breakfast. Sophie was drawing at the table. What's he going to do? Olivia hesitated. He's going to expose her. Our mother's going to prison, Grace. Grace turned off the stove. Your mother deserves it. She destroyed an innocent man. Olivia sighed. I know, but Edward has no idea what she's capable of when she's cornered. My mother won't let this happen. She will fight back. And it will be terrible. Grace sat down. What are you saying? Olivia was crying. I'm saying you need to protect Edward. Because our mother is going to do something desperate. And when Victoria Harrison gets desperate, people die. Olivia showed up at Grace's house 3 days after the discovery. A suitcase in her hand. A black eye poorly hidden with makeup. Can I stay here for a few days? Grace opened the door. She didn't ask any questions. Olivia came in. Sophie was at school. Olivia finally spoke. Bradley hit me. Last night, when I told him I really wanted a divorce this time, Grace squeezed her hand. Did you file a report? Olivia laughed. It was a bitter laugh. File a report against a thorn? My mother would kill me before he ever got arrested. Olivia's story was different from Grace's, but the prison was the same. 20 years ago, Victoria had chosen Bradley Thorne for her daughter. An old money family, political connections. Olivia was 22, in love with a literature professor, a simple, intelligent, kind man. Victoria found out. She threatened to cut Olivia off from the family, took away her credit cards, froze her bank accounts. Olivia gave in. She married Bradley in a ceremony with 300 guests. A honeymoon in Paris. She came back pregnant. Victoria demanded a DNA test because she didn't trust Bradley. The stress of the accusation, the constant tests, the insinuations. Olivia lost the baby at 22 weeks. Bradley blamed her. Victoria pretended she had nothing to do with it, and Olivia never got pregnant again. A scarred uterus. A scarred heart. For 12 years, Olivia lived in a sham marriage. Bradley had affairs. She knew. He drank. She hid the empty bottles. Social events were a rehearsed play. Fake smiles for photographs. Whispered insults at home. Olivia tried to get a divorce 3 times. Victoria stopped her every time. The Thornes are an important family. We can't have a scandal. On the 3rd attempt, Bradley hit her for the first time. Olivia hid the bruises. She told Victoria, "Did you provoke him? What did you say to make him so angry?" Olivia stopped telling her, stopped asking for help. She accepted that she was trapped, until Edward found the documents. Until she realized that Victoria wasn't an untouchable goddess. She was a criminal. And if she could fall, Olivia could be free. Grace made tea. You'll stay here as long as you need to. But you have to press charges, Olivia. Olivia looked out the window. If I do that, my mother will use it against Edward. She'll say we're turning the family against her. She'll manipulate the situation. Grace sat down. Your mother's already doing that. The difference is that now you have a choice. Olivia turned, tears finally falling. I'm so scared of being alone, of not knowing who I am without the Harrison name. Grace held her face in her hands. You're Olivia. Not a Harrison, not a Thorne, Olivia. And that's more than enough. That night, Grace told Edward about her father. A secret she had kept for 12 years. They were lying in bed. Sophie was sleeping in the next room. Olivia was in the guest room. Grace took a deep breath. I need to tell you something. About my family. Edward turned on his side. What is it? Grace stared at the ceiling. My father didn't disappear. He went to prison. Edward waited. She continued. I was 8. He worked as a security guard. One night there was a robbery where he worked. He fought back. He shot his gun. He killed a 16-year-old kid. He was convicted of manslaughter. 20 years in prison. Edward took her hand. Grace. She wiped away a tear. My mother told me he had gone away on a trip. I believed her. I waited for him for years, until I found out the truth when I was 25. I went to visit him in prison once. He didn't want to see me. He said I should forget he ever existed. Edward held her. That's not your fault, Grace sobbed. I know, but I've always been ashamed. I always thought that if I told anyone they would see me for what I really am, the daughter of a killer, an orphan, a nobody. Edward pulled back to look her in the eyes. You are not your parents. You are who you chose to be. And you chose to be strong, brave, the best mother Sophie could ever have. At the company, rumors were spreading. Employees whispered. Partners asked for private meetings with Edward. Richard Vance, the wronged man, was contacted by Edward. They met in a discreet coffee shop. Richard was older. Gray hair, deep wrinkles. Why are you looking for me now? Edward pushed an envelope with the documents across the table. Proof of what my mother did. You were innocent. I'm going to clear your name. Richard read them. His hands were shaking. 20 years. I lost 20 years because of her. My wife left me. My children don't speak to me. My reputation is ruined. Edward lowered his head. I know. There are no excuses. But I can offer you compensation, financial and public. Richard closed the envelope. Compensation won't give me my life back. Edward nodded. It won't. But it's what I can do. Richard stood up. I'll accept. Not for the money, but because I want to see Victoria Harrison pay for what she did. Edward held out his hand. Richard shook it, but there was something in his eyes. An old anger, a deep one, the kind of anger that isn't satisfied with justice. Edward saw it, but he was so focused on doing the right thing that he ignored the warning sign. New York society quickly took sides. At the clubs, at dinner parties, at charity events, everyone was talking about the Harrison family. I heard the daughter-in-law is behind all this. I always thought that Grace woman was a gold digger. Edward is a good man. She manipulated him. Victoria built everything. Now the daughter-in-law wants to tear it all down. The gossip columns publish speculative articles. Crisis in the Harrison family, daughter-in-law versus mother-in-law. Old photographs of Grace at the hospital. From nurse to heiress. The rise of Grace Taylor. The pressure was suffocating. Grace would go to the grocery store. Neighbors would turn their heads. Mothers of Sophie's classmates canceled playdates. Sophie can't come over anymore. Sorry, we have a full schedule. At the pediatrician's office, other mothers whispered. Grace pretended not to hear, but Sophie noticed. Mommy, why doesn't Juliana play with me anymore? Grace would kneel down. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, sweetheart, and children get hurt because of it. Sophie didn't understand, but I didn't do anything wrong. Grace would hug her. I know, my love. You didn't do anything. Edward defended Grace everywhere. Business meetings, social dinners. My wife has nothing to do with this. It was my decision to expose the truth. But the more he defended her, the more they seemed to believe she was a manipulator. Poor Edward, blinded by his marriage. The narrative was set, and Grace became more and more isolated. She stopped going out. She stopped answering the phone. Olivia stayed with her. Ignore them. People like that don't matter. Grace looked out the window. But Sophie matters, and she's hurting. Richard Vance came to see Edward again 2 weeks later. Not at a coffee shop, at the office. He had lawyers with him. He didn't want a private settlement. He wanted to sue Victoria publicly. He wanted a trial, the media. A full-blown scandal. Edward hesitated. Richard, this will destroy the company too. Richard smiled. It was a cold smile. I know, and I don't care. You offered me compensation. I want it. But on my terms. Edward tried to negotiate. Richard wouldn't budge. Either we do it my way or I go to the press alone and tell them everything, including the fact that you've known for weeks and have done nothing. A brutal moral dilemma. Doing the right thing meant destroying a 3-generation legacy. Not doing it meant being an accomplice. Edward came home that night defeated. Grace saw it at the door. What happened? He told her about Richard, about the lawsuit, about the consequences. Grace sat down. What are you going to do? Edward ran a hand through his hair. I don't know. My mother's a criminal. She deserves to pay, but this will ruin everything. The company, the family name, the jobs of 200 people. Grace took his hand. You can't control how people react to the truth. You can only control whether or not you tell it. Edward looked at her. What if I'm destroying everything my grandfather and my father built? Grace squeezed his hand. They built an empire. Your mother built it on lies. Let the empire fall. Rebuild it with the truth. Victoria found out about the lawsuit before she was officially served. She showed up at Edward's house unannounced, 10 o'clock at night. She banged on the door until he opened it. We need to talk, now. Edward let her in. Grace was putting Sophie to bed. Victoria sat in the living room. Richard is going to sue me. You allowed this. Edward remained standing. You stole from him. You destroyed his life. Yes, I allowed it. Victoria stood up. You have no idea what you're doing. This lawsuit will bring out things you don't want to know. Edward crossed his arms. What things? Victoria hesitated. It was the first time Edward saw real fear in her eyes. Your father didn't die of a heart attack. Silence. Edward slowly sat down. What did you say? Victoria closed her eyes. Your father was poisoned. By me. Slowly. Over a period of months. Edward couldn't breathe. You're lying. Victoria opened her eyes. I'm confessing. He was going to leave me. For another woman. He was going to take half of everything. I didn't let him. Small doses of arsenic. The symptoms looked like a heart attack. The doctor never suspected. Edward stood up. His legs were shaky. Why are you telling me this? Victoria took a step. Because if this lawsuit goes forward, they'll investigate everything. They'll exhume the body. They'll find out. And you'll be the son of a murderer. Sophie will be the granddaughter. Grace appeared on the staircase. She had heard everything. Victoria turned to her. Now do you understand? Everything I do is to protect this family. You think I'm a monster, but I'm a survivor. Grace came down the stairs. You killed your husband. Victoria didn't deny it. And I'd do it again. Because it was him or me. My reputation or his. I chose me. Edward was in shock. Grace stood between them. Get out of my house. Victoria looked at Edward. If you don't stop Richard, I'll tell him about the poisoning. I'll use it in my defense. The media will love it. The son who exposes his murderous mother. The Harrison family will end spectacularly. She left. The slam of the door echoed like a gunshot. Edward collapsed on the sofa. Grace sat next to him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Edward whispered, My father. She killed my father. Grace hugged him. We have to go to the police. Edward pulled away. And condemn my own mother? Turn Sophie into the granddaughter of two killers? My grandfather on her side was one too. Grace took a deep breath. Edward, she confessed. We can't ignore it. He stood up. Not today. I need to process this. He went up to their room. Grace was left alone in the living room. Her mother's music box was on the bookshelf. She opened it. The Crooked Ballerina spun. Somewhere Over the Rainbow played. And Grace cried, because the rainbow she was looking for was hidden behind darker and darker clouds. 3 days later, Mr. Pierce called Edward. I need to see you urgently. In my office, alone. Edward went. Pierce looked older, tired. Edward, there's something you need to know. He handed him an envelope. Your mother is sick, pancreatic cancer, stage 4. 6 months at most. Edward read the medical report. His hands were shaking. Does she know? Pierce nodded. For 3 months now. She's asked for absolute secrecy. She's having me change her will. She wants to leave everything directly to Sophie, bypassing you and Grace. Edward let the envelope fall. Pierce sighed. A final revenge. She wants you to be the guardians of a fortune you can't touch. She wants Grace to take care of her in her final months. She wants to be in control until her last breath. Edward left the office in a daze. In the parking garage, he called Grace. My mother is dying. He told her everything. Grace was silent on the other end of the line. Then, in a quiet voice, I'm sorry, Edward, he laughed. It was a humorless laugh. Me too. But not for the reason you think. I'm sorry that I still love her. After everything, I still love my mother. Grace understood. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Edward took a deep breath. The lawsuit. I can still stop it. Richard would accept a generous settlement. My mother could have her last few months in peace. Grace said nothing because there was no right answer. Only impossible choices. Edward hung up, sat in his car, and for the first time in his 38 years of life, he allowed himself to cry. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I read all of them and reply with love. And if this story is touching you, please leave a like. Edward was driving on the expressway when the brakes failed. 10 o'clock at night. Heavy rain. Light traffic. He pressed the pedal. It went straight to the floor. Nothing. He tried the emergency brake. The cable was loose. The car was accelerating on its own. A curve ahead. He turned the wheel. The car skidded. Hit the guardrail. Rolled over 3 times. Paramedics were on the scene in 15 minutes. Edward was still conscious. Trapped in the wreckage. blood streaming from his forehead. They called Grace. Your presence is required at Mount Sinai Hospital. It's urgent. Grace arrived in a hurry. She had left Sophie with Olivia. Edward was in the ICU. The doctors were grim, internal bleeding. We're doing everything we can. She sat in the waiting room. Her hands were cold. Her body was shaking. 3 hours later, a doctor came out. A look she knew well. She had seen that look dozens of times when she worked in the I'm so sorry. We did everything. Grace didn't cry right away. She stood there, processing. Edward was dead. Her husband, Sophie's father, the love of her life, dead at 38. In an accident that made no sense. The police came, routine questions. Ma'am, do you know of anyone who would want to harm your husband? Grace answered mechanically. No, maybe. She didn't know anymore. They mentioned an investigation. The brake lines had been cut. The emergency brake cable had been sabotaged. Murder, not an accident. But there were no witnesses. No cameras on that stretch of road. No proof. The case was closed in a matter of weeks. Grace knew who did it. Deep down she knew, but she had no way to prove it. Victoria had won, in the cruelest way possible. The funeral was a nightmare. The Harrison family excluded Grace from the arrangements. Victoria chose the casket, the flowers, the church. Grace arrived in a taxi, a simple black dress. Sophie holding her hand, asking in a whisper why Daddy was sleeping in a box. People stared, judged, whispered. I heard she caused this. Edward was so stressed because of her. Poor Victoria losing her son because of that woman. Grace held Sophie tighter. She didn't cry. She couldn't. If she started, she would never stop. At the church, Victoria sat in the front row. A security guard stopped Grace. Immediate family only. Olivia intervened. She's the widow. Victoria looked back. Her eyes were red but dry. She's not family anymore. Grace took Sophie to the back row. The service lasted an hour. The priest spoke about a man Grace barely recognized. Edward Harrison, a pillar of the community, an exemplary son. Nothing about the loving father, the devoted husband, the man who chose truth over comfort. The burial was worse. Victoria threw the first flower, Olivia the second. Grace couldn't even get close to the grave. Sophie was crying. I want to see Daddy. Grace carried her away, far from that circus of hypocrisy. At home, Grace sat in the dark. Sophie had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from crying. Olivia had gone to deal with divorce paperwork. Grace was alone, completely alone for the first time in 12 years. She looked around, the house Edward had bought, the furniture they had chosen together, the pictures on the walls. A life built brick by brick. And now? A widow with no resources of her own? The house was in the family company's name. Their joint bank accounts had already been frozen by Victoria. Grace had $300 in her wallet. Nothing else. Would she go back to the 400-square-foot apartment, raise Sophie alone on a nurse's salary? If she could even get a job, of course. 12 years out of the profession. Who would hire her? She thought about giving up. It would be easier. Take Sophie and disappear. Move to a new city. Start over from scratch. Victoria would keep the money, the company, the mansion. Grace would have her daughter and her dignity. Maybe that would be enough. But then she remembered Edward's last words. At the hospital, him squeezing her hand. Protect Sophie from the truth, but don't let my mother win. Grace had promised. And no matter how much it cost, she would keep that promise. She found Edward's journal in his desk drawer. Worn brown leather. She had never read it. She respected his privacy. But he was dead now. She opened it. The last entry was from 3 days before the accident. Grace, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to tell you in person. My mother threatened me again. She said that if I didn't stop Richard, she would kill you. Not Sophie, you. Because without you, I would fall apart. She always knew my weak spot. I asked Pierce to prepare a new will, a secret one, leaving everything to you and Sophie, half to each of you. My mother can't know. If something happens to me, Pierce has instructions. Forgive me for not being strong enough to protect you while I was alive. I hope I can do it in death. I love you. Always. Grace read it 3 times. The tears finally fell. Edward knew. He knew that Victoria would kill him. And still he tried to protect them. A new will meant that Victoria had no control, but it also meant that Edward had foreseen his own death. He had lived his last few weeks knowing, and Grace hadn't noticed. She was so focused on her own survival that she hadn't seen her husband saying goodbye. The guilt was crushing, a physical pain in her chest. Sobs that woke Sophie. The little girl appeared at the door. Mommy? Grace quickly wiped her face. Come here, sweetie. Sophie climbed into her lap. Are you sad? Grace hugged her. I am. But I'm going to be okay. We're going to be okay. But she didn't believe it. How could they be okay without Edward? Without a family? Sophie was 7 years old. She would grow up without a father, with a broken mother, a murderous grandmother, an inheritance stained with blood. What kind of future was that? Grace rested her chin on Sophie's head. There was no way out. Victoria had won. And Grace had lost everything. Her husband, her home, her identity. All that was left was pain and an innocent daughter who depended on her. It wasn't enough, but it would have to be. Olivia came back 4 days later. She found Grace still in her pajamas. The house was a mess. Sophie was watching TV, eating cereal straight from the box. Grace, are you okay? A stupid question. Of course she wasn't. Olivia sat down. Pierce called. The reading of the will is tomorrow. Grace didn't react. Olivia put her hands on her shoulders. You have to go. Grace looked up. Her eyes were empty. What for? Your mother's going to leave everything to Sophie. I'm not getting anything. I already know how it ends. Olivia hesitated. Edward called me a few days before he died. He said he had prepared something, that you would need to trust him. One last time. Grace picked up her mother's music box, opened it. The ballerina spun. The music played. Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Edward used to sing that song to put Sophie to sleep. Now it was a painful memory. Grace closed the box. Olivia, I don't have the strength to fight anymore. I'm tired. Olivia knelt in front of her. My brother died protecting you. The last thing he did in his life was to secure your future. Don't let it be in vain. Go tomorrow. Face our mother. One last time. For Edward. For Sophie. For you. Grace looked at Sophie. The little girl was drawing on the floor. A little house with 3 people. Mommy, Daddy, me. But Daddy was in heaven now, she had explained with a star above him. That drawing broke something in Grace. Or fixed it. She didn't know. But she felt a shift. Fury replacing despair. Victoria had taken Sophie's father from her. She wouldn't take her future too. Grace stood up. I'm going to take a shower. Can you stay with Sophie? Olivia smiled. Relieved, I can. In the shower, Grace let the hot water burn her skin. She washed away days of grief. She put on a simple black outfit, put on red lipstick. A small act of rebellion. Victoria hated it when she wore bright colors. Perfect. She combed her hair, left it down, looked in the mirror. The woman looking back was different. Older, more tired, but still standing, still fighting. Grace went back to the living room. Olivia, I need you to be a witness tomorrow. To what your mother did. To what she is. Olivia nodded. I've already told Pierce. I'm ready. Grace prepared documents that night. Her marriage certificate, Sophie's birth certificate, old photos, letters Edward had written, proof of their 12 years together. If Victoria wanted a war, she would get one. Grace wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to cry. She was going to fight. She put everything in a simple folder. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would carry herself. She would show no weakness. Victoria fed on weakness. Grace would offer her stone. Midnight. Sophie was asleep. Grace sat on the bed she had shared with Edward. His side still smelled like him. She lay down there, hugged his pillow. Forgive me for not noticing, for not protecting you. But I will protect our daughter. I promise. No matter what happens tomorrow, Victoria is not going to win. Not completely. She closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she slept without nightmares. Because she had made a decision. And decisions, even desperate ones, brought a strange peace. Grace walked into Mr. Pierce's office at 3:40 in the afternoon. Victoria was already sitting there. A victorious smile on her lips. Olivia next to her, tense. Richard Vance leaning against the wall, observing. Sophie was drawing hearts in the chair next to Grace. Mr. Pierce was sweating. A sealed envelope with a golden crest lay on the mahogany desk. The clock on the wall marked every second like a judgment. Victoria broke the silence first. Can we begin? I have other engagements. Pierce adjusted his tie. Yes, we are all present. He opened a folder, began to read. I, Edward Harrison, being of sound mind and body. Victoria interrupted. Get to the point. Pierce cleared his throat. Edward leaves his entire share of the company, real estate, and investments to Sophie Harrison, under the guardianship of... Victoria smiled. Me. Pierce hesitated. Her paternal grandmother, Victoria Harrison. Grace didn't react. She had expected this. And Victoria looked at her. Did you hear that? My granddaughter will inherit everything. You get nothing. Grace stood up. She walked to the desk. Her movements were controlled. Deliberate. I want to read the letter. Pierce blinked. What letter? Grace pointed to the sealed envelope. That one. Edward told me there was a letter. A private sealed one. Victoria turned pale. There is no letter. Grace looked at Pierce. Mr. Pierce, did my husband leave instructions regarding a sealed envelope? Pierce was sweating profusely. He looked at Victoria, he looked at Grace. Yes, there is a letter, with instructions that it be opened only in the presence of all heirs. Victoria stood up. This is absurd. I won't allow it. Grace turned to her. Her eyes were firm. You are no longer in charge. Edward is dead. This letter is his final wish. Victoria took a threatening step forward. You have no right. Grace didn't back down. I do. I am his widow, the mother of his heir. And I am going to read that letter now. A tense silence. Mr. Pierce took the envelope. His hands were shaking. He broke the seal. He took out a piece of paper. He began to read aloud. Grace, if Pierce is reading this, it means I died before I could protect you. Forgive me. In the last few months, I discovered things about my mother that changed everything. She killed my father. A slow poisoning. She confessed when I threatened to expose her for theft. But there's more. She sabotaged my car not to kill me. To kill you. We switched cars that morning. Remember, you were going to pick up Sophie from school. I took your car because mine was out of gas. The brakes were meant to fail with you behind the wheel. Not me. Mr. Pierce stopped. His hands were shaking so much that the paper was about to fall. Olivia covered her mouth. Richard Vance straightened up. Sophie kept drawing, oblivious. Grace was frozen. Victoria was as white as a sheet. Pierce continued. I have proof. Payments to the mechanic. Bank transfers. Recorded conversations. Pierce has everything. If I'm dead, she did it. And I want you to know, I want justice. Not for the money, for the truth. Grace, you taught me that the truth matters. Even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Protect Sophie, but not from the inheritance, from the legacy of lies. I leave half of everything to you, half in a trust for Sophie. My mother has no right to anything. Olivia is a witness to this document. Pierce is the executor. Forgive me for not being strong enough in life. I love you, always. Absolute silence. Victoria sat down slowly. Olivia was crying silently. Richard Vance had a half smile of satisfaction. Grace looked at Victoria. You tried to kill me. You killed your own son by mistake. Victoria didn't answer. She was looking at her own hands. Pierce picked up the phone. I'm calling the police. Victoria looked up. No, her voice was broken. It was the first time Grace saw real vulnerability there. It won't make a difference. Grace walked closer. It won't make a difference? You killed Edward. Victoria looked at her, tears finally falling. I know, but it wasn't supposed to be him. It was supposed to be you. You destroyed my son. You took him away from me. You put these ridiculous ideas of truth and justice in his head. He was perfect before you. Grace felt her anger boil over. He was a prisoner. You controlled him like an object. I set him free. Victoria stood up. You killed him. Grace slapped her, hard. The sound echoed through the room. Victoria fell back into her chair. Olivia didn't intervene. Richard Vance watched, fascinated. Sophie finally looked up. Mommy? Grace knelt in front of her daughter. It's going to be okay, sweetie. Mommy is just a little upset. Sophie looked at Victoria. Is Grandma crying? Grace took a deep breath. Yes, she is. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they do very bad things. Sophie went back to her drawing. Grace stood up. She looked at Pierce. Call the police now. Pierce dialed. Victoria didn't try to run. She just sat there, defeated. For the first time in 50 years, Victoria Harrison was not in control of anything. The police arrived in 12 minutes. 2 detectives. Pierce handed them the documents, the proof Edward had compiled. The bank transfers to the mechanic, the recording of Victoria threatening Edward, the emails exchanged with an intermediary. Everything was meticulously documented. Edward had prepared a murder case against his own mother. He knew she would act. He just never imagined he would be the victim. The older detective looked at Victoria. Victoria Harrison, you are under arrest for attempted murder and manslaughter. He read her rights. Victoria didn't resist. She let them handcuff her. As she walked past Grace, she stopped. You won, are you happy? Grace looked her in the eye. No, because Edward is dead. And no victory's worth that. Victoria was taken away. Olivia broke down. Grace hugged her. It's over. Olivia sobbed. Our mother is a murderer. Grace held her tighter. I know. Richard Vance applauded slowly. An impressive performance. Grace turned. Do you have something to say? He smiled. I do. I want my share. Edward promised me compensation. Now that he's dead, you owe me. Grace looked at Pierce. How much? Pierce checked the documents. $3 million, plus 20 years of interest. $6 million in total. Grace nodded. Pay him, but he's out of the company. He sells his shares to me. Richard Vance laughed. Why would I do that? Grace took a step. Because if you don't, I will have every transaction you've made in the last 10 years investigated. And I'm sure I'll find something. Men like you always leave a trail. Richard Vance stopped smiling. You don't have the power to do that. Grace took out her phone, dialed. Hello? Yes, this is Grace Harrison, Edward's widow. I need a full audit of the company, starting with the minority shareholders. Richard Vance snatched the phone from her, hung up. All right, I'll sell my shares. At market value. Grace took her phone back. Half of market value. Or the investigation begins tomorrow. Richard Vance looked at Pierce. This is blackmail. Pierce shuffled his papers. This is a negotiation, and considering the alternative, I suggest you accept. Richard Vance stormed out, slamming the door. Olivia was still crying, Sophie was still drawing, Pierce was preparing documents. Grace sat down, exhausted. Victoria arrested. Richard Vance out of the company. Edward dead, but avenged a bitter victory. A very bitter one. Pierce handed her a paper. Edward's will. You are now the owner of 50% of everything. Olivia receives 10% as compensation for her years of abuse. Sophie receives 40% in a trust until she turns 25. You manage everything. Grace looked at the numbers. 50 million divided. 25 million for her. 20 million for Sophie. 5 million for Olivia. More than enough money. But Edward was still dead. Olivia wiped her face. What are we going to do now? Grace put the documents away. We're going to go home. We're going to start living. Without Victoria. Without lies. Without fear. Olivia nodded. Can I keep living with you? Just until I get on my feet. Grace hugged her. You can stay as long as you need. We're family now, for real. Sophie stood up. She showed them her drawing. A little house with 4 people now. Mommy, Aunt Olivia, me, and Daddy in heaven with wings. Is it pretty? Grace held the drawing. Tears finally falling. It's perfect, my love. Perfect. They left the office. The sun was bright outside. A contrast to the darkness of the past few months. Grace held Sophie's hand. Olivia on the other side. 3 women walking toward an uncertain future. But walking together, Victoria had lost. Edward would rest in peace. And Grace was finally free. Free from judgment, from lies, from control. She had a daughter, a sister, a home, a future. It wasn't what she had planned, but it was a new beginning. And new beginnings, Grace had learned, were all she ever needed. 6 months later, Grace woke up at 7 in the morning now. No longer at 2 in the afternoon like a night shift nurse. Her life had completely changed. Coffee with Sophie before school. Olivia was already in the kitchen making pancakes. A new routine, a family rebuilt on the rubble of the old one. The house was no longer Edward's. Grace had sold it. She bought a smaller brownstone in Greenwich Village. 3 bedrooms, a small garden, a balcony where she had her coffee and watched the birds. A place she chose, not inherited, not imposed. Hers. The company was different. Grace and Olivia took over the management together. Their first decision was to fire half the board, the old guard that had protected Victoria for decades. Their second decision was to publicly give the money back to Richard Vance, a press conference, an admission of past mistakes, an official apology. The media covered it for weeks. The Harrison heiresses cleared the family name. Their third decision was to create a fund for employees' families. College scholarships, extended health insurance, readjusted salaries. The company lost immediate profits, but it gained loyalty, respect, something Victoria's money had never bought. Victoria was serving her sentence in a state prison, 8 years for manslaughter. Olivia visited once a month. Grace never went. Sophie asked about her grandmother twice. Where's Grandma? Grace told her a version of the truth adapted for a 7-year-old. Grandma made some bad choices. She's paying for them now. Sophie accepted it. Children accept things more easily than adults. Olivia would come back from her visits devastated. She has no regrets. She still thinks she did the right thing. Grace would hug her. Then don't go anymore. But Olivia kept going. Because forgiving wasn't forgetting. It was choosing not to carry hatred. Richard Vance went bankrupt 6 months after selling his shares. He invested in a fraudulent scheme. Lost everything. Grace saw the news in the paper. She felt pity, not satisfaction. Revenge is never satisfying. It only perpetuates a cycle. Mr. Pierce became a close friend. Dinners every other week. Stories about a young Edward. A balance of laughter and tears. Sophie called him Grandpa Samuel. He accepted the title with pride. At 63, a bachelor with no children, he finally had a family. Sophie went to therapy every Thursday afternoon. Dr. Carla, a child psychologist specializing in grief. The first few months were difficult. Nightmares, tantrums, questions Grace didn't know how to answer. Why did Daddy go away? Didn't he love me anymore? But slowly, Sophie was processing. She drew fewer broken hearts, more rainbows, more houses with gardens. She still talked about her father. Would Daddy like this drawing? Is Daddy proud of me? Grace always answered, "He is, sweetie, very proud." Olivia blossomed after her divorce. She lost weight not from dieting but from happiness. Her hair, which she had always kept up, was now down. Colorful clothes replaced the neutral tones Bradley had demanded. She met someone, Daniela, an environmental lawyer. Kind, intelligent, patient. Olivia hesitated to tell anyone. She was afraid of being judged. Grace hugged her. "You deserve to be happy." "With whoever makes you happy," Olivia cried. "Thank you." Daniela had dinner with them the following week. Sophie loved her. Aunt Olivia is really smiling now. Grace went back to the hospital. Not as a nurse, as a donor. She created a support program for young widows. Psychological support, temporary financial aid, legal guidance. Everything she didn't have when Edward died. The first meeting had 12 women. The second had 28. The third had 45. Different stories. A universal pain. Grace listened. She shared. Not as a wealthy heiress, as a woman who understood loss. Grace was in Mr. Pierce's office again, not for a will, for a donation. $2 million to the foster home where she grew up. A complete renovation. College scholarships. A new library. Edward would be proud. Pierce signed the papers. Grace looked out the window. The same view as 6 months ago, when Victoria had screamed, when the envelope had been opened, when her life had completely changed. It's not about his pride. It's about my peace. Pierce smiled. "You've changed." Grace nodded. "I had to, or I would have died too." Sophie ran in. Olivia behind her. Sorry, she escaped from the reception. Sophie jumped into Grace's lap. "Mommy, Aunt Olivia said we can get a dog." Grace looked at Olivia. She shrugged. "You said we could consider it." Grace sighed. A happy sigh. "All right, we can get a dog." Sophie squealed with joy. Pierce laughed. Edward hated dogs. Grace hugged Sophie. "I know, but Edward isn't here. And we are." The sentence came out harsher than she intended, but it was the truth. Life went on, with or without the permission of the dead. In the car on the way home, Sophie was humming. Olivia was driving. Grace watched the city go by. 6 months ago, she was broken. A widow with no future. Today, she was a businesswoman, a present mother, a chosen sister to Olivia, a benefactor to her community. Not because of the money was a consequence. The change came from a decision. The decision not to let Victoria win, not to let pain define her future, to choose a new beginning every day until it became reality. Grace took the music box out of her purse. She carried it with her always. She opened it. The ballerina spun. Somewhere Over the Rainbow played. But now the music didn't just bring sadness, it brought a memory, good and bad. Edward singing to Sophie. Her mother opening the box for the last time. The rainbow was no longer over impossible clouds. It was here, in this car, in this imperfect but real family. Grace closed the box, put it away. She didn't need to search for the rainbow anymore. She was living in it. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. Grace would never forget Edward. She would never completely forgive Victoria. But she chose not to be a prisoner of the past. Olivia was doing the same. Sophie would grow up knowing the truth, but not being defined by it. Their family wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. What about you? Have you ever had to face someone who tried to control your life? Have you ever had to rebuild from scratch after losing everything? Have you ever had to choose between revenge and peace, between bitterness and a new beginning? Have you ever felt that you weren't strong enough, but you kept going anyway? Share your experience in the comments. Tell us how you overcame it, or how you're still overcoming it. Your words might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today. We're not alone on this journey. There are thousands of us starting over every day. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a like if this story touched your heart. Next week, the story of a woman who discovered a secret will 40 years after her wedding and had to choose between the truth and her family's peace. Remember, you are stronger than others say, braver than you imagine, and you deserve to start over as many times as you need to. See you soon.